Hello, everyone. My name is Faraaz. I'm an engineer at ReadMe. I'm going to be moderating today's panel. The goal of the panel is to kind of talk about what you need to do after you actually launch to get users. And so our panelists are going to be Matt Pasternack and Justin Johnson. Justin was one of Keen's earliest employees. He started off as a developer evangelist and is now in charge of developer experience. Matt Pasternack was Clever's first hire out of YC and is now VP of sales. So I think we have like an interesting juxtaposition between a developer evangelist and a sales, and so we'll get to hear about both their perspectives on how to grow a company. So please help me welcome Justin and Matt. Just grab that one. Cool, thank you. Okay, test. All right, great. So just to start off, if could you guys tell me, like, just to give the audience a little bit of context about what Keen and Clever does? Can you give me a little bit of like what Clever does, what Keen does, and where you guys were when you started and where you're at now? Any kind of metrics you can share or whatever.
I'll jump in first. So Clever is a education data platform. We serve K through 12 schools. And we basically centralize data out of a ton of legacy databases that these schools maintain, and make it available to developers over a single simple API. We are 5 years old. Started in 0 schools with 0 developers, and we're now over half of the school districts in the country use Clever, and there's a rich ecosystem of apps on top of that as well.
Keen is a developer platform for building on top of event data. So you can send us arbitrary JSON from anything connected to the internet. Could be a server, a client, IoT device. Then you can store it, process it, and present that data. I started at the company as the first non-technical person to go to market. We had a handful of customers. Now we have thousands of customers, and we're low 40s numbers of people.
Very cool. So kind of just a broad question, but kind of like talk me through like how you got your very, very first customers.
At Keen, we were really active in community. Even before I came on as a developer evangelist and community person, pretty much everyone in the company was giving talks or doing training, education. And so we got our first customers by bringing people in the door that way, and then just giving really hands-on support. So everyone that came in, we talked to and tried to help solve their problems with them.
For us, so just again, Clever is, you can think of Clever like a hub and spoke model basically. So it's really a two-sided marketplace where we need to get data from schools, and then we make the data available over an API. So we had to solve that problem twice. We had to get first school users as well as first developer users. One of our co-founders was a former director of technology at a small school system in Colorado, and so it was really natural to begin by going to the developers that his school district used. And he was also friends with lots of other folks in similar positions at other schools. So getting that initial nucleus was really, I'd say, through personal network.
Okay. Is there any kind of like personal investment that people have to make to like get integrated with Clever?
Yes.
Right.
So there's
right.
quite
So obviously the same thing is true for Keen. So I was wondering, how do you like get over like the technical investment or the time investment when you're an early stage API company to get to people actually use you? How did you get over that initial hump?
Sure. I mean, for Clever, I would say, look, your first version of an API at the very beginning is not as good as your final version, or not final, but your version years later. So at the beginning, our technology, honestly speaking, was pretty weak, pretty underpowered. There wasn't a lot you could do with it, and people who built integrations didn't always do the best job. So we had a little bit to offer. They built okay integrations, and we made up for everything else with incredibly high touch support. And then over time, our API gets better, their integrations get better. We invest a lot more on sort of the product sides of the triangle, and our support becomes more manageable.
I think one of the main promises of an API as an API company is that you're going to abstract away something that's hard and make it easy. It should look like magic to the end user. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, there's no work involved. So it's less about the work, it's more about building trust and brand recognition, I think, in the community. Because someone needs to believe that you're actually going to solve their problems, and that if they scale with you, you're going to scale with them, and you're going to continue to provide a great service. And when you're a really small company, it's kind of hard to say yeah, we can do that. And it's like, well, have you done it yet? Kind of. I mean, yes, I guess to this scale, but if we get to that scale, we're going to have to prove it. So just figuring out how to interact with people in a way that builds trust over time is really important. Was important for us.
Okay. Next question is what are some non-obvious things about selling an API versus a consumer product that you guys have learned?
I think one of the non-obvious things is that design is so important. When someone says design, you often think of something visual or something more tangible than an API, because API is just a set of code that runs a series of things when you tell it to do something or gives you something. But the way that you present the information about how to use the API is of the utmost importance. And we as a company have learned that over the years. Documentation is so key. If there's something wrong in your docs, you're going to make people so mad because they're going to sit there for hours and try to do something that you tell them you should be able to do. And if it doesn't work, it's really a problem. So figuring out how to design the experience and interacting with the API there's a lot of art and nuance in that.
Okay.
I'd say for us it was really just bridging the difference between the technical and the non-technical users or people who would be deriving value from the API. And in the early days, a lot of folks, they hear API and they think, oh, this must be an incredibly technical product, and the value is probably only to the developers of the company, because they're the people who are literally building against the API. If you want to build something that you're selling for a lot of money, in some cases it would just be a developer tool, but in many cases it has to go beyond being a developer tool to actually impacting many others or the business owners of the company. And so for us it was bridging that gap. In the early days, in many conversations I'd never even mentioned the word API. That wasn't relevant. What we did was important, the value we delivered was important. The methodology we used, a REST API, was relevant only to one of the several different purchasers at our customers.
Okay, and how did you bridge the gap between the technical and the non-technical?
Yeah, often, it's just having different conversations. So it's realizing early on that, look, can you do a sale or an adoption if you're free to technical users only? If you can, great. Don't worry about bridging the gap. Just, find your technical users. But if part of your sale is going to be non-technical folks, make sure you're ready to have two completely different conversations, and one of them might literally not really mention API.
Okay. Next question I have, how do you think developer evangelism and sales work together? What is kind of the optimal relationship there? There's obviously overlap. There's also differences. Maybe even go into a little bit about the differences and how you define it, how you define each.
Sure. Well, as an evangelist, I think that the most important thing an evangelist does is educate people about the technology itself. I think evangelists are community builders, and community exists outside of business even, and definitely outside of your own brand. So investing in people, not just to make a sale, but to help the community grow and learn is really important. Evangelism is more of a long-term play, and I kind of view sales as a short-term thing where you've got to close deals to keep the business going, right? And there's an intersection somewhere in there where evangelists are bringing deals in because of the work that they're doing, and sales is absolutely building brand and kind of the long-term view, but they're kind of on different ends of the spectrum from a business perspective in my mind.
Yeah, I'd say one thing about super early days of selling an API or selling a product, it is going to look a little bit like evangelism. You don't have established product market fit. You haven't done this before. You haven't proved that sales motion. So, in the early days, you don't necessarily want quotas. You don't necessarily want a hard metric you're trying to hit, because you'll probably over-optimize for the metric and miss a lot of the learnings that go along the way. So early day sales, I think, is very much like evangelism. Some of the conversations lead to a deal, some don't, but you're spreading the gospel regardless. As you get further down the path and sales starts to look like actual sales with quotas and such, I think one of the biggest differences is just that sales, you're requiring the customer to not only believe in the value, but literally commit to the value from his or her pocketbook potentially before they've ever used it. It depends what your pilot or proof of concept process looks like. And so, are you able to get people to part with money before getting the value from the service? Versus evangelism, it's like, hey, try this out, try this out, try this out, and then as you get value, use it more.
Do you think like in the early days, it's what's the distribution between the two if you were to like weight it?
Yeah,
like
for us at least, I'd say much more evangelism in the early days. More evangelism, less sales, and then as you go on, that probably inverts a little bit. Less evangelism, more sales.
I think it really depends on the business and its needs at the time. Like if you're a startup going after the Fortune 500, right? Like you're gonna need a sales team right away,
right.
Because the Fortune 500 doesn't buy through community at all ever, really. I don't think. So I guess it's just like, what are your resources and what are you actually trying to do in the early days? But for a developer tool where if you're trying to build a large base and get developers from all shapes, sizes, and areas to kind of know what you do, it's evangelism first, and then sales like follows in at a time.
Okay. What are some mistakes that you made early on while you were first getting started? Maybe whether it was closing a sale or just anything like.
I think for us, one was pricing just being really, really hard, and finding yourself getting kind of locked into pricing before you've really gotten to think about it or really validate. I mean, the early stages, you're moving so fast, especially if you're a startup, that you want to get adopters, you want to get sales done, you want to get things moving. If you're a little under optimized on price, who cares? But over time, that's just to matter a lot more. And price has a way of kind of locking you in because, if you quote a price to someone that's very different from a price someone else got quoted and they hear about that, then, it'll feel more like a betrayal. So trying to just nail that thing between just not like getting yourself too locked in on a price with the early customers.
How do you do that?
Is important. It's hard. The way we tried to do that at the very beginning, was rather than propose a specific price, we just framed it as a revenue share. Now, we didn't have any mechanisms to like look at their revenues or collect revenue in any way sort of on the, where they were using our product, but it was more just trying to define our value, knowing that, hey, our customers are gonna have all kinds of different revenue rather than, lock in a specific price point. Let's try and see if we can get a consistent % of revenue as a validation of our value. That was short-lived, but I think it was a nice anchoring mechanism.
I've been at the company for almost 4 years now, so I could probably just talk about, for another hour about all the things I think we did wrong. Like hindsight's 2020. One thing that I'd say that we did wrong is actually be inflexible about changing pricing. Pricing is really hard, but once you find something that works, like you stick with it. But we stuck with it too long because we learned along the way, and then we were kind of scared of applying our learnings because what we were doing was working, but then that ended up biting us. Another thing that we did was we tried to mechanize sales too early. So, we got a VC round, yay, everyone celebrates, let's hire, go fast, throw gasoline on the fire. And I at the time it felt right, and then like 7 months later it didn't feel so right. So figuring out how to like really understand like the way that you're going to market and if it scales, and testing that slowly as opposed to like just like plugging in a team was one of the learnings that we had.
And like, how did you guys change your did you guys end up changing your pricing or?
Yeah, so we changed our pricing pretty dramatically recently, actually, from like pay up front for a certain amount of data, and then if you go over that amount of data, we're gonna just kick you up a notch, as a tier, to a fully metered kind of more Amazon or Heroku style pricing, where it's like you're gonna pay at the end of the month for what you actually used. The learnings there is that if you don't tie the revenue or the money that you're making to the value that your platform actually provides. Like you get this very uneven end where some customers that aren't getting, quote, like whatever value we think we're giving to customers are paying a lot of money for a little amount. And then some customers that aren't paying very much at all are just hammering us on the compute side. And they're not paying us much money, but they're costing us a ton of money.
Right.
So we're trying to right that by changing the pricing more around like what our platform actually does.
Like, I guess in the early days, then just kind of give yourself as much flexibility as possible with pricing. Cool. How can you? What was the company's reasoning, or like your company's reasoning for having sales or developer evangelism as one of like the very first hires?
Question. In our case, I think it was just actually sort of randomness. I mean, I happened to hear of Clever in a just unique moment where I personally understood the problem that Clever was trying to solve, because I had been trying to solve it in my own startups 2 times over, and realized it was just a really hard problem, but that there was a very specific technical solution which would work. And so, I saw this, knew it, went to the company, and it was just like what I was good at was sales, and so that was the thing.
So you sold them your position.
Exactly. So if I hadn't come along, maybe the next hire would have been totally different. So I don't know, maybe that's a unique story, but that was our case.
I think we were, or Keen was, trying to follow a bit of a playbook that some developer tools companies before us had started to set. So looking at companies like Twilio and SendGrid, and Stripe was a little bit earlier than us, but they've been really successful in building evangelism teams. And as a developer-first API-only company, we followed that path too. Did our own little take on it, but
Okay.
don't change what is working, I guess.
How can you, like in the early days, like how can you get like a quote unquote large deal? I don't know, like if you guys focus on that, but like how can you make that happen?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Should you focus on that at all?
Yeah, I mean the easiest way to do it from a sales perspective is to discount, and that's what your large buyers are normally looking for. So they're used to basically saying, hey, we're huge, we get 75% off list or whatever it is on everything we buy, so we'd expect the same thing here. Well, surprise, like our list is a little made up. Like we don't really have a list. Like we're sort of figuring out this pricing ourselves. So 75% off something that's made up. It's just like you just start to get into a very, very weird place. So one piece of advice is do it once or twice. Like I think it is helpful to begin to build that motion of what it's like to have a large company that's relying on your service to learn what does it take to support them, what does it take to make them successful, what does it do to your business to get that level of income. But don't go out to every single company that could possibly fit that target demographic and kind of pitch them that same discounted price, because a year or two later you're going to look at your market and regret it and say, God, I would really love to be charging 5 times that price to some of these really big companies. So it's okay to do it once or twice at the beginning, and that'll get you a good logo and get you someone who's fully committed to your vision. But don't try and scale it too fast. Just focus on making those 1 or 2 big companies successful, and you're probably going to win them through discounts. So you don't need to be like that creative. That's probably how you get them.
So when we were early, we didn't have the scale to actually service some of the bigger customers that came to us. So a lot of times when they came and said, hey, can you handle this scale? We just had to say, no, we'll get there eventually, but our platform isn't mature enough to handle that. And then there was other companies where the problem wasn't necessarily like the amount of data they were sending us. It was just the use case was very interesting and different. And they were like, can you do this? In those cases, as a developer tool company, we had to actually partner with them to build engineering, with engineering and their engineering department to build things to solve their problems. And so we did win some big deals pretty early on, and it was through helping companies solve problems that were novel, that they either didn't have the resources to solve themselves or they didn't want to solve themselves.
You actually paired with their engineering team to
Yeah, we would bring their engineering team to talk to our engineering team to figure out how we could fulfill a need with the platform that we already had. We didn't want to have this like cobbled together thing where we were supporting, you know, different things for different customers. We needed to make sure that it was going to be a fit for our long-term vision, and also something we could actually execute on while supporting our other base. So it's just like figuring out, being honest with what we could do, and then finding the right opportunities, and then actually closing them. It's like a really long process with custom contracts and really expensive lawyers. So that's how we did it. I don't know. I don't know if that's the right way.
Yeah. So obviously now you guys are operating at a different scale than when you guys started. So what's changed? Like what are kind of the stages in between, and like what kind of changed from your day to day or just overall process, specifically around evangelism or sales?
I think for us, I mean, one of the biggest learnings, and I mean, this happens, I think, as any company scales, not just API companies or anything else, but it's just really beginning to segment your customer base and just realizing that, what's going to work well in one segment is going to fail miserably in another segment. The people who will be really good in one segment might not be the right people for another segment. And rather than just taking like a single hammer to every problem, starting to think, hey, let's really understand the segment. Let's understand the segment. Let's understand the segment, and kind of optimize for their needs. So I'd say sort of most of what's been successful for us during our scaling years, the last couple of years, like operational excellence has really come down to how well are we able to segment. You definitely don't want to do that too early, because you end up creating a lot of process overhead on when like your focus should just be talking to a lot of customers and learning a lot. So you don't want to jump the gun, but if you wait too long, you start to realize, hey, we have kind of like a startup team trying to solve a scale problem, and that doesn't work either. So.
A lot's changed when you go from having 100 customers to having many thousands of customers. You can't give the same level of service to everyone. Like, we really prided ourselves on giving our best possible support to everyone that sent a support ticket. Like, we tried to make sure that our queue was empty at every single day, and we even had people like hop in on weekends to like answer tickets. And there's just no way we could possibly scale that out. And now that we have some companies that are rather large, sending us crazy amounts of data and relying core piece of their business, and then other companies, we're just like helping them solve a small problem. Like, we have varying degrees of expectations about what our support will be. So we figured out, like, when we sell a big deal, it is about people wanting a discount, because they're going to send us a lot of data and they're going to be using a lot of Keen, right? So we figured out like large contracts, discounts, SLAs, figuring out how to like queue different, we still want to give great support to everyone, but we can't give like same day, same hour support to everyone, because it's practically impossible. So yeah, just operationally figuring things out, scaling things in a way that's scalable for us.
One other point I was just thinking is, as you mentioned, just like custom contracts and custom SLAs and whatever, the big customers. One kind of interesting quirk is that in the early days, if you're trying to save money, you're probably not like over-investing in lawyers and having like the most perfect enterprise level agreements. The cool thing is that once you finally do get into contract discussions with your first enterprise grade customer, their lawyers are going to take whatever like kind of crappy contract you have and like completely redline it and actually turn it into a really good contract. Now, granted, like, for the lawyers in the audience, like, it'll be a little more favorable to them. So you want to be careful, but it is amazing how much free legal advice in the early days you can get from that first enterprise customer before then you hire your own lawyers and turn the tables a little bit. But
so just send them a really bad contract and they'll take care of the rest.
Exactly. Literally, they will. I mean, some of them have lawyers that just love this. Like, they love taking a really crappy contract and putting in all the conditionals and clauses and everything.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, like, let's say, you're year in, you have, some users, you realize that your pricing is pretty bad. And you have some data. Is it like immediately obvious what your pricing model should be, or like how did you think about pricing?
Yeah. No, pricing is not obvious. It's incredibly freaking difficult.
Even with like.
It's just really, really hard. Maybe it's maybe a little bit different in consumer. I don't know. We're B2B, so I don't know. I'm just speculating. But in consumer, hey, like, you could just sort of A/B test price pages and see what happens, and run a whole bunch of experiments. But if you have a reasonably long sales cycle and you're selling B2B, you just never know. If I had a better sales team, would they sell well at the current price point, or is it that the price point itself is wrong? And how do you value software when the margins are so large? So it has nothing to do with the cost. It's just about like the value that's being delivered. So I think pricing it's like one of the biggest levers you can turn in sales, but you don't want to turn it too much because then your pricing will be really inconsistent. So it's like the last thing you turn to when nothing else is working.
Yeah, pricing is really hard. The really hard part about it too is when you don't have a mature platform and you're trying to scale it, right? Like you go from N customers to N plus whatever. It's often that you want to like charge way more for something that you think doesn't really cost you that much, and charge a lot less for something that's really expensive, because it's not necessarily about hitting a margin on everything you do. It's more about getting the right price point that the market's going to accept. Like you're providing this value, and regardless of how they're using your platform or what the different pieces of your platform cost, like you need to figure out how to provide that amount of value to the market to make this much money more than you actually spend. And that's a tricky game. It just takes a lot of learning.
What are some mistakes that you see other companies doing when it comes to like non-obvious, I'd say, like around sales or in evangelism?
It's a tough one because like most of the mistakes are kind of obvious, or at least they are to me.
Okay.
I think that treating evangelism like a sales function is a mistake I see bigger companies make when they're getting into evangelism. And startups, it's like, I've been guilty of this. I don't know if anyone else in the room has, but like thinking if you build it, they will come. So like, engineering, building a great thing, everyone should use this. It's awesome. It's going to solve all the problems. Why isn't no one buying my thing? So like figuring out how to go to market early on is really important. It's not just building a great thing. That's obvious though. I'm sorry, guys.
I don't know. I mean, at least in the education vertical specifically, I think you see some mature, basically widely adopted solutions in the industry build an API and then try to just extract a huge amount of value from that API, which just feels like a huge mistake. I mean, the value of being a platform is the long-term potential for lock-in of your core solution. We're unusual. I mean, we're an API-only company, so it's a little bit different. But for some of these folks where they've spent a decade or more building up a giant customer base, why add friction to that lock-in by charging a really high price on your API? Just maybe make it free or make it really low cost, or do whatever it takes just to make as many possible users and make them as successful as possible, because that's what you're really looking for, not the incremental revenue.
Great. I'm getting lights flashed at me over there, which means I think we're out of time. So thanks again, Justin and Matt, for coming here. That's it.